sheltered its sheltered its people during various invasions, and it resounds with majestic natural beauty, which had an important and a lasting influence on him. And in contrast, though, to these beautiful, peaceful surroundings, he was born into a time of political and interreligious strife, as well as one that was full of corruption by the religious authorities during the latter part of the 400-year Ottoman occupation. He wrote of his experience when his mother began to realize he had a creative bent and a spiritual sensitivity and gave him a book of Leonardo da Vinci's artwork. He said, "I'll never forget it. He was 6 years old. That moment, as long as I live, it was as if a ship lost in the fog had suddenly found a compass." His grandfather had been a Maronite priest, and thanks to his mother, he was taught all the great biblical stories which captured his imagination at a young age. But his father was not very reliable, prone to drink with gambling debts, and he was accused of embezzlement while working for a local Ottoman administrator, and he was sent to prison, and the entire family's property was lost. And his mother eventually decided to emigrate to America with Khalil's older half-brother and his 2 younger sisters just before he reached his teenage years. And he spent only 12 short years in this kind of magical mountainous setting, but it was to serve as the foundation of his spirituality and worldview for the rest of his life. He settled into America at Boston's South End, and Khalil began to learn English, and he was profoundly influenced by a whole new world of literature and art that began to open up for him. However, concerned that he was probably losing his Arab culture and those values, his mother sends him back to Beirut for his high school years, albeit under the watchful care of a Maronite priest in a Maronite school there in Ashrafia in Beirut. And the story unfolds from there when he comes back to Boston, and within an 18-month period, one of his sisters dies and his half-brother to tuberculosis, and then he lost his mother to cancer. And then he had a devastating fire that pretty much destroyed all of his artwork to date. And that's when he began to start writing more intensely and became very close to a group of Arab immigrant writers there. And he began to write outspoken articles in Arabic magazines and books and newspapers. And as an immigrant, he discovered he actually had the ability to write and say things that he would never have been able to do had he been living in the Arab world at that time. And he began to call on his Lebanese people to question ideologies as he himself began to grapple with religion and spirituality. He spoke out in his articles against oppression by the Ottomans and was concerned by sectarian strife, often fueled by religious authorities and their hypocrisy. And then he became very passionate for women's rights. And for the next 10 years, from 1903 to 1913, from the age of 20 to 30, he would seek to balance the push and pull of these two linguistic and artistic worlds as he found himself poised at a confluence of cross-currents between the East and West. Determined to tear down walls of injustice, he eventually found himself threatened with excommunication from the authorities of the Maronite Catholic Church of his upbringing. Then he wrote the Arabic novella, Spirits Rebellious, and he became an advocate for women well ahead of his time. He had this incredibly high view of women at that time. Friend, stranger, lover, mother, sister, and he consistently infused in his writings and his painting his admiration for them. And it's actually quite noteworthy considering the patriarchal society that he grew up in, as well as what was going on in the US at that time, because women were in the thick of the fight for the right to vote during that period. However, albeit an activist early on, over time, he often wrote of growing into our greater selves. That was one of his most common phrases. And he matures into someone with a graciousness towards others and a spirituality that reaches across the divides of humanity. At a very crucial time in his life, his lifelong friend and patron, Mary Haskell, comes into a supportive role for him, and she actually funds 2 years of art education. This is his portrait of her, where he can master the fundamentals, and out of that comes the style and the uniqueness that we now know him for. After his time in Paris, he moved to New York City, and he continued to publish works in Arabic and exhibit his artwork at a few very significant galleries. And in 1918, his first book written in English, which of course is his second or third language, was published, titled The Madman. And it was quickly followed by a second book called The Forerunner. And then by 1923, his third book came out, The Prophet, gaining quickly worldwide acclaim, that they could hardly keep it in stock. He also worked on his longest English book, titled Jesus, Son of Man, that he worked on most of his adult life, and it was the last book that was published that he wrote in English just 3 years before his death at the age of 48. And the more I studied about his fascinating life, the more intrigued I became really with this kind of inner journey. And more than anything else, I would say it was evident that he lived his life kind of toward a deeper dimension and wove this passionate intent into his writings and his art. He was a natural mystic who quite simply sought to build bridges and tear down walls. The best analogy I can think of when I think of his life is of a river that flowed deep and wide. Because as he plumbed the depths of his inner life, he went to the core of human existence. He was forever exploring the deepest of life's questions. On the purpose of being, he writes, spiritual awakening is the most essential thing. It's the sole purpose of being. He who does not befriend his soul is an enemy to humanity, for life emerges from within. He described himself as going into the silence, intentionally so. He wrote, only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. He named his studio the Hermitage. These are a few photos. And you see those brass candlesticks. He's giving the context of almost an altar and a church in that regard. And I love his short story called The Tempest. It's a young man roaming the cedar forest, and a storm comes down, and the young man takes shelter with a hermit in a little kind of indented shelter cave. And he wants to learn the secrets of this hermit. He'd heard about him. The hermit's name is Yusuf al-Fakri. And the hermit gives him all this great wisdom and beautiful language. And then finally, the climax of the story is the hermit goes out into the storm, leaving the young man in the shelter. And he says, I'm going now to walk through the night in the tempest. It's a practice I enjoy greatly. I hope you would teach yourself to love the tempest. And he consistently succeeded at crafting these poetic invitations to journey to the depth of oneself, exploring that rich reservoir within. And he was preoccupied during his entire life with the depths that he knew the spirit of humanity was able to plumb, and the heights he was convinced humanity was able to scale, but always striving toward that deeper dimension. And he saw depth everywhere. He would describe, I want you to hear the voice within the voice in his art and his writings. The good friend of his, a spiritual writer and American architect, Claude Bragdon, said of him, his power came from some great reservoir of spiritual life, or else it could not have been so universal and so potent. But the majesty and beauty of the language with he clothed it was all of his own. The depth of Khalil's spiritual journey led to an extraordinary breadth of spirit, which he experienced really as the oneness of humanity. The reservoirs he cultivated in the deep gave him the capacity to go wide. And arising from his internalizing of the Eastern and Western influences in his life, this faith kind of, or worldview emerges that transcends all cultures and religions. Addressing his fellow Arabs in the Middle East, Khalil wrote, humans are divided into different tribes and clans and belong to countries and towns. But I find myself a stranger to all communities and belong to no settlement. The universe is my country, and the human family is my tribe. Thou art my brother and sister because you are human, and we are both children of one sacred spirit, We are equal and made of the same earth. He went beyond religion to the kind of a core of a universal spirituality. As he so profoundly said, your neighbor is your other self dwelling behind a wall, and understanding all walls fall down. He recognized, of course, the necessity of boundaries and nations, and yet he strove toward what you might call a borderless citizenship that transcended geography. I love the way he expresses his collective embrace of humanity with this poetic visual imagery of a cloud. He writes, should you sit upon a cloud, you would not see the boundary line between one country and another, nor the boundary stone between a farm and a farm. It's a pity you cannot sit upon a cloud. And touching on one of the most sensitive topics of all, especially also in the Middle East, religion, he writes this, you are my brother and sister, and I love you. I love you worshiping in your church, kneeling in your temple, and praying in your mosque. You and I are all children of one religion, for the varied paths of religion are but the fingers of the loving hand of the Supreme Being, extended to all, offering completeness of spirit to all, and anxious to receive all. And finding a way to communicate a non-sectarian version of spirituality was one of his, what he would say was his highest callings. And it led to the creation of this prophet, the book, The Prophet. He felt all of his life was actually a preparation for this book. It's known as the Little Black Book, and this is what it looked like when it first came out. He wrote, it's the biggest challenge of my life. My entire being is in the prophet. Everything I've ever done before was only a prelude to this. And this is the picture on the cover, echoing that hand with the fingers holding humanity. He felt a sense of sacred responsibility about the book, as if it was almost like a holy book. Indeed, actually, the process of writing it was a process of rebirth for him. And embodying East and West, it speaks to people of all different faiths. And I've got to say, although Khalil often spoke about God, you can't get away from that when you reading him. His writings and art were infused with a much deeper concern, and that was living in harmony with one another and with all of creation. And to Khalil, while spirituality served as an attempt to connect with the transcendent, or however one wants to call it, he recognized it cannot be found solely in creeds and dogma. And his search for God actually led him to unearth that which was woven in the very fabric of creation. In other words, the environment. And in an age when issues in our environment are at the forefront, with deep respect for the earth, Khalil's holistic worldview rings out. Just after Easter in 1931, after a battle with ill health, Khalil lay dying. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, the same hospital that had received survivors from the Titanic disaster for treatment, and then was used again for those who were victims of September 11. And at the age of 48, with cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung, Khalil slipped from this world into a realm he believed would be an endless dawn, forever the first day. And the breadth of diversity and the outpouring and appreciation of his life says it all, across all different religious and cultural divides. And as requested in his will, Khalil's body made the pilgrimage back to Lebanon. And upon arriving by ship in Beirut, the coffin was opened and he was posthumously awarded the Decoration of Fine Arts medallion by the Ministry of Education for his life's work. And then led by governmental dignitaries, French military officers, diplomats from all over the world, and leaders from Christian, Muslim, Druze, and Jewish communities, a mosaic of diversity, along with crowds of school children. The entourage processed past thousands of admirers who lined the streets until they reached the Maronite Catholic Cathedral, where his body was blessed by the Archbishop. Once thought of as a rebel by the church, in the end, he's welcomed home as a celebrated native son. There were many tributes reflecting Gibran's all-embracing appeal and universal appeal. He was a Sufi sage for all humanity, said one of the speakers there that day in the memorial in Beirut. Then the procession on foot made the 50-mile journey from Beirut up to his home village of Bishari, and all the way lined with townspeople. They held 20 different ceremonies on the way up. Then he was eventually laid to rest, as he had requested, in the hermitage grotto of his childhood there in the village of Bishari, which is now actually part of the Gibran Museum. And more than ever, Khalil's own words rang true. For in one soul are contained the hopes and feelings of all mankind. One of my favorite allegories by Khalil is titled The River. It's frequently read at funerals or memorial services. And it's set up in his beloved Kadisha Valley, the Sacred Valley, and it visually highlights, actually, Gibran's life journey, one that was mixed with both joy and suffering, but which always led to that deeper dimension. The river. In the valley where the mighty river flows, two little streams met and spoke to one another. And one stream said, "How came you, my friend, and how was your path?" And the other answered, "My path was most encumbered. The wheel of the mill was broken, and the master farmer who used to conduct me from my channel to his plants is dead. And I struggled down, oozing with the waste of those who do not but sit and bake their laziness in the sun. But how was your path, my brother?" And the other stream answered and said, "Mine was a different path. I came down the hills among fragrant flowers and shy willows. Men and women drank of me with silvery cups, and little children paddled their rosy feet in my edges. And there was a laughter all about me, and there were sweet songs. What a pity that your path was not so happy." And at that moment, the river spoke with a loud voice and said, come in, we are going to the sea. Come in, and speak no more. Be with me now. We are going to the sea. Come in, for in me you shall forget your wandering, sad and joyful. Come in, and you and I will forget all our ways when we reach the heart of our mother, the sea. Khalil's life journey of depth and breadth can't help but challenge all of us in one way or another. His words, I think, continue to reverberate in hearts and minds, stirring the reader or the hearer, whoever he or she may be, to journey in life toward a deeper dimension. And he reminds us that it's time to reach across the divides that surround us and to break down walls of injustice and inequality. It's time to build bridges in whatever ways we can conceive and seek peaceful resolutions. It's time to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. It's time to unite and see our own reflections in the faces of others. It's time to find a way to carve out room for silence and respect for the environment. And it's time to delve deeper into our own spiritual traditions, past all the imperfections and baggage and trappings, to the core of life. In one final vignette from Khalil, his words inspire and challenge us towards our greater selves, as he used to say. It's titled, "Said a Sheet of Snow White Paper." Said a sheet of snow white paper, pure was I created, and pure will I remain forever. I would rather be burnt and turned to white ashes than suffer darkness to touch me or the unclean to come near me. And the ink bottle heard what the paper was saying, and it laughed in its dark heart, but it never dared to approach her. And the multicolored pencils heard her also, and they too, though never came near her. And the snow white sheet of paper did remain pure and chaste forever, pure and chaste and empty. I close with the moving words of Khalil's good friend, Michal Naimi, who wrote the first biography on him just 3 years after his death. For some purpose unknown to you and to me, Gibran was born in Lebanon at the time he was born. And for a reason hidden from you and me, Arabic was his mother tongue. And it would seem that the all-seeing eye perceived our spiritual drought and sent us this rain-bearing cloud to drizzle some relief to our parching souls. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so very much for sharing what is, I think I speak for all of us, timely words. For all of you here this evening, for all of you joining us online, thank you. We are going to share an iftar together here in a few moments. So we'll adjourn now to go prepare accordingly. And then I hope we can all share some camaraderie and perhaps not leave a sheet of paper empty tonight. Thank you.
Do you have any questions during iftar? Yeah.
We'll take questions as we go over to the reception. Please don't. For those who would like copies of the books, please, we'll make sure to make that possible too.
All right.
Or you can do both at the same time.
Exactly.
I will have